Takeoff time 0820. Army pilots will take off first. Good luck, and God bless you. The shortest briefing in the history of American air power. 16 bombers, 80 men, 0 chance of return. This is the Doolittle Raid, April 18th, 1942. The mission that the United States military said was impossible, and then did anyway. The attack on Tokyo that changed the Pacific War before the Pacific War had a name that Americans recognized, before the campaigns had been planned, before anyone in Washington was willing to say out loud how long it was going to take. To understand why the Doolittle Raid mattered, you have to understand where America stood in the first 4 months of 1942. Pearl Harbor happened on December 7, 1941. In the 80 days that followed, the United States sustained a sequence of military disasters that historians still struggle to fully account for. The Philippines fell. General Douglas MacArthur's forces on Luzon were driven back to the Bataan Peninsula, then to the island of Corregidor, then off Corregidor entirely. 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were marched 65 miles to a prison camp. Thousands died on the march. The Bataan Death March, as it became known, was one of the worst atrocities committed against American prisoners in any war. Guam fell. Wake Island fell after a defense that lasted 15 days and produced a brief moment of public inspiration before ending in surrender. Hong Kong fell. Malaya fell. Singapore fell. The largest surrender of British-led forces in British history. 85,000 soldiers captured by a Japanese force that had marched down a peninsula on bicycles. The Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, fell, taking with it the oil fields that Japan needed to sustain the war. The Japanese defensive perimeter, established in the first 90 days of the Pacific War, extended from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, to Burma in the west. It enclosed an area larger than all of North America. American carrier aviation had not been at Pearl Harbor the day of the attack. The carriers had been at sea, and they remained the only instrument of offensive power the United States possessed in the Pacific. They were fragile and irreplaceable. 2 of the fleet's pre-war carriers had already been lost, the Langley to Japanese air attack, and shortly after, the Lexington would be lost at the Coral Sea. There were no land bases within range of Japan. The American public knew the war was going badly because the news said so every morning. Public morale, in the polling data available to the Roosevelt administration, was holding. Americans had accepted that the war would be long and hard, but the accumulating defeats had produced something dangerous, a creeping doubt about whether the defeats would ever be reversed. Roosevelt needed something to happen, not a strategic victory. The conditions for a strategic victory did not yet exist. The production lines that would eventually produce 300,000 aircraft, 80,000 landing craft, and 6,500 ships were just beginning to accelerate. He needed an image, a symbol, something that told the American public and the Japanese government simultaneously that the war was not going the way Japan expected. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, asked a planning officer named Francis Lowe whether a medium bomber could be launched from a carrier deck. The carrier deck was approximately 500 feet of moving steel. The medium bomber they needed, something large enough to carry a worthwhile bomb load and range far enough to hit Japan, required at least 1,200 to 1,500 feet of runway at minimum under normal conditions. Lowe said he thought it could be done. King brought in Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle. Doolittle was one of the most accomplished aviators in the world. He had set the world speed record in 1925. He had been the first pilot to execute a complete instrument flight, taking off, navigating, and landing entirely on instruments without visual reference to the ground, demonstrating that flight in weather and darkness was not only possible but controllable. He had earned a doctorate in aeronautical science from MIT. He had spent years testing the limits of what aircraft could structurally and aerodynamically withstand. He was also an Army Air Corps officer who understood that impossible problems were usually just engineering problems that hadn't been attacked correctly. He looked at the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. It was larger than a carrier-based aircraft, but smaller than the B-17S that would have been preferred for a long-range strike. The B-25 had a wingspan of 67 feet. It weighed 27,000 pounds fully loaded. It could carry a 3,000-pound bomb load over 1,350 miles with full tanks. The key calculation was deck run, under ideal conditions, full throttle, a 25-knot headwind generated by the carrier steaming at full speed into a wind. Doolittle calculated a B-25 could break ground in approximately 800 feet. Carrier decks were not 800 feet. They were around 450 feet of available launch distance, accounting for the deck park of aircraft and the carrier's island structure. The difference would have to be made up by wind speed and pilot skill. Doolittle requisitioned 16 B-25s, had them stripped of unnecessary equipment, and began modifications. The lower turret was removed to save weight. Additional fuel tanks were installed to extend range. The Norden bomb sight, a classified piece of precision equipment, was replaced with a simplified sight Doolittle had designed himself, later nicknamed the Mark Twain. The top-secret Norden was not going on an aircraft that might be captured. The pilots and crews were recruited from the 17th Bombardment Group. They were told only that they were volunteering for a dangerous mission and asked to agree before being told what it was. All of them agreed. Training began at Eglin Field in Florida, then continued at Glenview Naval Air Station in Illinois, where pilots practiced carrier deck takeoffs using a section of concrete runway painted to represent the available deck space. None of them had ever taken off from a carrier before. The plan, as Doolittle developed it, was to launch from 400 miles from Japan. The B-25s would fly to Japan at low altitude, below radar, hugging the surface of the Pacific, strike multiple targets across several cities, and continue southwest to China, where they would land at airfields controlled by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. There was no way to bring the B-25s back to the carrier. The aircraft could not land on a carrier deck under any circumstances. The landing gear was not designed for it, and the aircraft was too large. Every crew knew they were flying a one-way mission. The plan assumed the carrier task force would not be detected before launching from 400 miles out. On the morning of April 18, 1942, USS Hornet was 650 miles from Japan. The launch was planned for the following morning. At 0600, a Japanese patrol boat named Nito Maru spotted the task force and began broadcasting a warning. The surface ships of the task force sank the Nito Maru, but the ship had been transmitting for approximately 15 minutes before it went down. The warning had been sent. Doolittle had to decide, turn back or launch now, 250 miles beyond the planned launch point. Launching 250 miles early meant the fuel calculations that had barely worked at 400 miles were now impossible at 650 miles. Most aircraft would not reach the Chinese airfields. Some might not reach the Chinese coast. Every pilot knew this when told. Every pilot took off anyway. The launches began at 0820. A carrier deck launch is not like a runway takeoff. A carrier deck pitches in heavy seas. The bow rises and falls with the ocean swell, sometimes 15 or 20 feet in each direction. The timing of the launch run has to account for this motion. The pilot begins his roll as the bow starts its upward pitch, so that he reaches the bow at the peak of the pitch and launches into the air with maximum upward momentum from the ship's motion. Get the timing wrong, and the aircraft rolls off the bow and goes into the sea. The first B-25, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle himself, rolled down the deck and climbed clear of the bow with 20 feet of deck to spare. All 16 launched. Not one went into the sea. 7 hours after launch, the lead aircraft crossed the Japanese coast near Inubosaki. The air raid warning systems had been active since the Nito Maru's transmission, but the geography of the situation was confusing to Japanese defenders. The expected American carrier strike would come from carrier-based aircraft, Dauntlesses, Devastators, Wildcats. B-25s were Army Air Corps aircraft. They operated from land bases. There were no American land bases within range of Japan. The first bombs fell on Tokyo at noon, local time. The 15 aircraft that struck the home islands hit targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. Factories, military facilities, and oil storage sites were hit. The material damage was limited. 16 B-25s cannot carry enough bombs to significantly damage a modern industrial city, but the damage to Japanese civilian confidence in the invulnerability of the home islands was immediate and lasting. Japanese air defenses pursued the bombers out to sea but could not catch them. The crews flew on toward China. What followed was a navigation challenge that no mission briefing had fully prepared them for. The crews were flying at night, in bad weather, over occupied China, with fuel gauges that all told the same story. Not enough. 15 of the 16 crews reached the Chinese coast. Most bailed out or crash-landed in darkness. Some came down in Japanese-occupied territory. Some came down over the ocean. Some came down in the mountains. One crew, short on fuel with no option, diverted to the Soviet Union and landed at Vladivostok. The Soviets, technically neutral in the Pacific War, interned the crew for over a year before releasing them through Iran. 3 crew members who crash-landed in Japanese-controlled territory in China were executed by the Japanese military, a specific violation of the laws of armed conflict, prosecuted at the Tokyo War Crimes trials after the war. 8 crew members were captured, held in prisoner-of-war camps under brutal conditions. 4 survived the war. Doolittle, who bailed out safely and was picked up by Chinese nationalist forces, believed the mission had been a failure. He told his crew that when they gathered after the raid, he expected to be court-martialed. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was promoted 2 grades to brigadier general, bypassing the rank of colonel entirely. The material assessment of the Doolittle Raid was accurate. The damage was minimal. The strategic military impact was negligible in direct terms. The indirect impact was the largest single decision in the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had staked his professional reputation and his Navy's strategic direction on the principle that the American carrier fleet could be located and destroyed before it could rebuild from Pearl Harbor. Doolittle's raid came from somewhere the Japanese did not expect. Yamamoto's analysis was direct. As long as the American carriers survived, they could project power against the home islands from unexpected directions. They had to be found and destroyed. He proposed an offensive to seize Midway Island, a central Pacific atoll from which American carriers could be baited into a decisive engagement. The plan was approved. American codebreakers, operating under the naval intelligence analyst Joseph Rochefort and his team at Pearl Harbor, had broken the Japanese naval code sufficiently to determine the target of the operation and its approximate timing. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his 3 remaining carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown caught the Japanese carrier force in the middle of a critical rearming sequence. The planes on deck were being rearmed from anti-ship torpedoes to land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway Island. The flight decks were covered with fuel lines, armed aircraft, and ordnance. In 10 minutes, dive bomber attacks sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Japanese Navy lost the core of its offensive carrier capability. The Pacific War was not won at Midway. The fighting would continue for 3 years. But the conditions for ultimate American victory were established by what Midway produced. Japanese air power was never fully reconstituted. American production continued to accelerate, and the strategic initiative shifted permanently. Midway happened because Yamamoto felt compelled to force a decisive carrier engagement. Yamamoto was compelled because Tokyo had been bombed. Tokyo was bombed because 16 B-25 crews took off from a carrier deck 650 miles away and flew to a target they knew they couldn't fly back from. The chain is long: 80 men, 16 aircraft. One morning, 3 of those men were executed. 1 died in captivity. 4 survived prisoner of war camps. Their names appear on the memorial at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. All of them went anyway. Here is what the Doolittle Raid actually required, in the specific terms of what each man aboard those 16 aircraft was being asked to do. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber was not designed to take off from an aircraft carrier. It was designed to take off from runways of 1,200 feet or longer. The available deck on USS Hornet, accounting for the space occupied by the aircraft parked aft of the launch position, was approximately 450 to 500 feet. The physics of the problem were not kind. To become airborne, a fixed-wing aircraft needs to generate lift equal to its weight. Lift is a function of airspeed, specifically the velocity of air over the wings. The faster the air moves over the wing surfaces, the more lift is generated. An aircraft taking off from a runway accelerates over the full runway length, building speed progressively until it reaches the velocity at which the wings generate enough lift to leave the ground. On a 500-foot deck, there was not enough room to reach that velocity under the aircraft's own power alone. The solution was the wind. Hornet was steaming at flank speed, approximately 28 knots, into a headwind of roughly 25 knots. Combined, this gave the aircraft approximately 53 knots of effective headwind before the engines generated a single revolution of thrust. When the B-25 reached the deck edge, it needed to be at a velocity that, combined with a headwind, produced enough airflow over the wings to generate the necessary lift. The margin was measured in feet. Doolittle demonstrated it first, personally, taking off from the bow of the carrier before dawn with roughly 450 feet of deck run in a heavy sea that pitched the bow up and down through a significant arc. He timed his launch to coincide with the bow rising. At the moment of maximum upward pitch, when the bow was at the top of its rise, and the deck angle was providing an additional few degrees of effective angle of attack on the wings, Doolittle released the brakes and the aircraft began its roll. The B-25 reached the edge of the deck with the bow still rising. It launched into the combined headwind. It climbed. 15 aircraft followed. Not one went into the sea. The flight to Japan lasted approximately 7 hours. The crews flew at low altitude, wave-top height for much of the ocean crossing, to avoid radar detection. Navigation was conducted by dead reckoning, tracking the aircraft's heading, airspeed, and time elapsed, and computing the estimated position from those inputs without any external reference. Navigation over open ocean by dead reckoning is extremely sensitive to errors in the input variables. A small error in the assumed headwind velocity, maintained over 7 hours, could produce a position error of 50 or 100 miles at the end of the flight. A small error in compass heading, maintained over the same period, could produce even larger errors. The crews navigating to Japan in the early morning of April 18, 1942, were doing so with 1942 instruments, in varying weather, with no radio navigation aids and no satellite reference to a target they had approached to this specific range for the first time in their lives. They found Japan. All 16 aircraft crossed the Japanese coast near their planned landfall points. The air defense situation in Japan at the time of the raid was complex in an interesting way. Japan had been at war for nearly 5 years, from the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, and its air defense system was calibrated for the threats it had actually faced. Chinese aircraft, operating from bases in China, with ranges that did not allow them to reach the home islands. The assumption built into Japanese home island air defense was that no aircraft could reach Japan from outside the defensive perimeter without passing through that perimeter, which Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns patrolled. The carriers that launched the Doolittle Raiders were outside the defensive perimeter. They were beyond the range at which Japanese defense planners had calculated any attack could originate. The B-25s appeared over the coast of Japan in the middle of the morning, when air raid drills had been conducted, but the idea of an actual attack was not seriously contemplated by the civilian population or by most of the air defense personnel. The first bombs fell on Tokyo at 1200 local time. Incendiary and high-explosive bombs struck industrial targets, military facilities, and oil storage sites across Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. The material damage was limited. 16 B-25s cannot carry enough bombs to significantly damage modern industrial cities. The psychological damage was different in kind and immeasurable in scale. The Japanese people had been told consistently and emphatically that the home islands were safe. that the Imperial Navy controlled the Pacific sufficiently to prevent any attack on the sacred homeland, that the war was going well, and victory was certain. On April 18, 1942, at noon, they heard American bombs falling on Tokyo. The Japanese government's response was immediate and multidimensional. Military commanders reported to the Emperor. The political apparatus began managing the public messaging, and the Imperial Japanese Navy began a strategic debate that would result in the order for the Midway operation. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had been arguing since Pearl Harbor that the American carrier force was the primary strategic threat to Japan's position in the Pacific. The Pearl Harbor attack had failed to destroy the carriers. They had been at sea on the day of the attack, and Yamamoto understood that carriers were the only instrument that could strike Japan directly. He had proposed an operation to lure the American carriers into a decisive engagement near Midway Atoll, destroy them, and eliminate the threat. The proposal had been debated within the Naval General Staff and opposed by officers who preferred other options. The Doolittle Raid ended the debate. When American aircraft bombed Tokyo while the Imperial Navy's leadership was in their offices in the city, the argument for finding and destroying the American carriers became unanswerable. The Midway operation was approved within days. The operation was planned for June 1942. The American codebreakers who worked for Joseph Rochefort's Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had broken the Japanese naval code, specifically the JN-25 operational code, sufficiently to identify the target of the operation as Midway and to establish its approximate timing. Admiral Nimitz positioned his 3 remaining carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet. On June 4, 1942, American dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown caught the Japanese carrier striking force in the middle of a critical rearming sequence. The Japanese carriers had launched a first strike against Midway and were recovering aircraft while rearming for a second strike. The flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were covered with armed and fueled aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance when the American dive bombers arrived overhead. In 10 minutes, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were fatally struck and sinking. The Japanese Navy never replaced those 4 carriers or the trained aircrew who died with them. The offensive carrier capability that had struck Pearl Harbor, invaded the Philippines, bombed Darwin, and threatened the Indian Ocean was gone. The Pacific War was not won at Midway. 3 more years of brutal fighting remained, but the strategic position that had existed before Midway, Japanese offensive superiority across the Pacific, ended on June 4, 1942. The chain runs directly back to April 18th. Doolittle's raid forced the Midway operation. The Midway operation forced the engagement. The engagement destroyed 4 carriers. The link between the raid and Midway is not coincidental. It is documented in Japanese staff papers, in the memoirs of Japanese admirals, in the official history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The 16 bombers over Tokyo produced the conditions for Midway. Doolittle thought the mission was a failure. When the damage assessments came in, and it was clear that 16 B-25s had not significantly damaged Japanese industrial capacity, Doolittle told his assembled crews that he expected to be court-martialed when he returned to the United States. He was awarded the Medal of Honor instead. He was promoted 2 grades, bypassing the rank of colonel entirely, to brigadier general. He said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come back. 3 crew members were captured by Japanese forces in China. They were tried by a Japanese military tribunal in October 1942 under a new order issued specifically to address the Doolittle Raiders, an order that retroactively made certain acts of war punishable by death under Japanese law. The 3 men, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. Their execution was a violation of the laws of armed conflict. It was prosecuted at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East after the war. The Japanese officer most directly responsible was sentenced to life imprisonment. 4 other captured crew members survived Japanese prisoner of war camps and returned home after the war. The full crew roster of the Doolittle Raid, 80 men across 16 aircraft, deserves to be read as what it was: a roster of people who volunteered for a mission they were told they might not survive, in aircraft they had never taken off from before, to a target they could not return from, in service of an objective that was primarily psychological rather than military. They all went anyway. Doolittle himself was the first off the carrier and the first to bomb Tokyo. He lived until 1993, dying at the age of 96. He spent his post-war years as a business executive, a scientific advisor, and a public figure who occasionally spoke about April 18, 1942. What he said in different formulations over the decades was consistent. The mission mattered not because of what the bombs did, but because of what the willingness to do it demonstrated. A nation that could launch 16 bombers from a carrier to bomb Tokyo 4 months after Pearl Harbor was not a nation that was going to give up. That message was received in Tokyo. It was received in Berlin. It was received in Washington, and in every American city where people were trying to understand whether the war was winnable. 37 nations are currently operating descendants of the doctrine, the tactics, and the strategic concept that the Doolittle Raid introduced: long-range strike from mobile platforms, psychological impact as an explicit operational objective, the willingness to accept high risk in exchange for disproportionate strategic effect. Every aircraft carrier in the world is, in a specific operational sense, a descendant of the mission that USS Hornet flew on April 18, 1942. 16 aircraft, 80 men, 0 expected to return. They all launched. Here is the detail that makes the Doolittle Raid unique in American military history. Every person who participated in it knew before they launched that they were probably not coming home. Not in the abstract way that combat soldiers accept risk, in the specific, calculated, mathematically certain way that pilots who have worked through the fuel consumption figures understand. The fuel math didn't work at 650 miles. Every pilot knew it. Doolittle told them. The fuel figures were not classified. The distance from Hornet to the Chinese airfields was not classified. Any aircrew member with a navigation computer could run the numbers in 10 minutes and arrive at the same answer. Most of us are not going to make it to the airfield. Some of us are not going to make it to the coast. They launched anyway. That decision, not Doolittle's decision to go ahead, but each individual pilot's decision to push the throttles to full power and roll down that deck, was one of the purest examples of individual courage in the history of the American military. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear, for a purpose that matters more than personal safety. The purpose here was specific: demonstrate to Japan, to America, and to the world that the Pacific War was not over in February 1942, that the United States retained the capability and the will to strike the Japanese home islands, and that the political decision to fight until victory, not until exhaustion, was backed by the willingness of individual Americans to sacrifice themselves in its service. The demonstration worked. The damage to Japanese industrial infrastructure was minimal. The bombs that fell on Tokyo and Kobe and Yokohama and Nagoya did not significantly degrade Japan's war-making capacity. The bombs that fell on the Japanese home defense psychology were a different matter entirely. Japan's civilian population had been told, continuously and confidently, that the home islands were impenetrable. The Imperial Navy controlled the Pacific. No enemy aircraft could reach Japanese cities. The war would be won in the Pacific before it ever threatened Japan directly. On April 18, 1942, at noon, bombs fell on Tokyo. That single fact, whatever its strategic significance in military terms, was psychologically decisive in ways that cannot be fully quantified. The Japanese government's immediate response was to tighten restrictions on media coverage, to arrest some Japanese citizens who had observed the raid and might share information. and to accelerate the home defense aviation program. Admiral Yamamoto's response was to accelerate the Midway operation. The Midway decision was the operational consequence that changed everything. The relationship between Doolittle's raid and the Battle of Midway is sometimes described as indirect or coincidental, as though Yamamoto's decision to seek a decisive carrier engagement would have happened anyway, and the raid simply accelerated a timeline that was already set. This is not how the Japanese naval records describe it. The specific argument made within the Naval General Staff debates of late April and May 1942, the argument that overcame the institutional resistance to the Midway operation from officers who preferred alternative strategies, was explicitly and directly based on the Doolittle Raid. The argument was this: American carriers can strike the Japanese home islands from positions we do not control and cannot predict. Until we find and destroy those carriers, the home islands are vulnerable. We cannot accept that vulnerability. We must force an engagement on terms we can control. Midway was the attempt to force that engagement. When the engagement came, when Spruance positioned Enterprise and Hornet to intercept the Japanese striking force on June 4th, when the dive bombers found the Japanese flight decks covered with armed and fueled aircraft in the middle of a rearming cycle, when the attacks went in, it was because Yamamoto had been compelled to force an engagement on a timeline that American intelligence had broken. The American codebreakers who read the JN-25 messages, the analysts at Station Hypo who identified Midway as the target, Nimitz, who believed them over the objections of Washington, Spruance, who positioned his carriers where they needed to be. All of it was in motion because 16 bombers had flown over Tokyo 6 weeks earlier. The scale of what Midway changed, 4 carriers sunk, hundreds of the most experienced Japanese naval aviators killed, Japan's offensive carrier capability permanently ended, is incalculable in comparison to the 16 B-25s that started the chain. But that is how strategic cause and effect works in war. The direct effect of an action is rarely its most important effect. The indirect effects, the second and third order consequences that ripple through the strategic system in ways that nobody fully predicts, are often decisive. Doolittle did not set out to cause Midway. He set out to bomb Tokyo and come home alive. He succeeded at the first. He barely survived the second, bailing out over China, evading Japanese forces, making his way back to American lines through a network of Chinese civilians and nationalist military contacts. His debrief was direct. The mission succeeded. The damage was minimal. The impact on Japanese psychology was real and significant. The individual crews performed beyond what anyone had a right to expect from men launching from a carrier in weather on a mission they knew they couldn't complete. He recommended doing it again if the strategic situation required it. The strategic situation never required it. The Battle of Midway made the conditions that had required the Doolittle Raid no longer exist. 80 men, 16 aircraft, 0 expected to return, 3 captured, 3 executed, 1 died in captivity, 75 came home. All of them, on the morning of April 18, 1942, looked at the deck of USS Hornet and at the sea beyond it, and at the math that said they probably would not reach China, and pushed the throttle forward. The last thing to say about the Doolittle Raid is about the men who were captured. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz were the 3 members of the raiding force who were captured by Japanese forces in China, tried under a law created specifically to prosecute them, and executed on October 15, 1942. Their trial was not a legal proceeding in any meaningful sense. It was held in October 1942, 6 months after their capture. The charges against them included the deliberate bombing of schools and hospitals, charges fabricated from whole cloth, since the targeting of the Doolittle Raid had specifically avoided civilian facilities. The sentence was death. The commander who ordered their execution knew the charges were false. The execution was political, a demonstration that Japan would punish attacks on the home islands, regardless of whether those attacks were conducted according to the laws of war. The execution was itself a war crime, It was prosecuted at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in 1946. The Japanese general most directly responsible, Shigeru Sawada, was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were 24, 23, and 21 years old when they were executed. They had volunteered for the mission. They had known they might not make it to the Chinese airfields. They could not have known they would be captured, tried on false charges, and shot. Their names appear on the Doolittle Raiders Memorial at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. There is a set of 80 silver goblets at the museum as well, one for each raider. For decades, the surviving raiders gathered annually to drink a toast from the goblets of the men who had died. As each raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. The last gathering of surviving Doolittle Raiders was in November 2013. 4 men remained. They drank from the goblets of the 76 who had preceded them. There are no more annual gatherings. All 80 goblets are inverted. 16 aircraft, 80 men, the chain that led to Midway, the year that led to the end. 80 men launched knowing the math didn't work. They went anyway. The chain that started at 0820 on a carrier deck ran all the way to Midway and beyond. That's what a single decision can do. Subscribe if you want more. New story every week, same honesty. Comment below. Did you know Doolittle thought the mission had failed? What do you make of that? Share this with someone who thinks World War II is old news. It isn't. Until next time, you know where to find us.